I'm going to show you in this video, with the help of an actual example from the SAT, a much quicker way to multiply complex numbers, and to do that in your head, because obviously you need to save time on the test and you need to do as much as you can inside your head. And so let's just give the question a read. In the equation above, a and b are real numbers and I is equal to the square root of -1. What is the value of a? So what they're saying is essentially you have two complex numbers, 15 minus 4i and 6 minus 3i. And when you multiply them together, obviously you're going to get another complex number in the form a plus bi, where a is going to be the real part of the complex number and bi is going to be the imaginary part. And they're only asking you for the real part. They're only interested in knowing the real part as the answer. And so what is the quick way to do this? To understand this, you need to realize that when I multiply a real number times a real number, I always get a real number. And the only other way to get a real number is to multiply an imaginary number with an imaginary number, right? So in this case, if I need the real part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply the real part of the first complex number with the real part of the second complex number. And I'm going to multiply the imaginary part of the first complex number with the imaginary part of the second complex number. And I'm going to do this in my head because I would know beforehand that this is the way to get the real part. So I'm going to take 15, which is the real part of the first complex number, and multiply it with a 6. And that's going to be 90, which can be figured out in your head easily. And then I'm going to take the second complex number, a -4i, and I'm going to multiply it times a -3i. Now this might seem like something that you can't do in your head, but we know that, it's actually pretty possible. You know what an I times an I is. It's an I squared, right? Which is a -1. So all you have to do really is just multiply the coefficients together, which are real numbers. You know how to multiply real numbers. You know how to multiply a -4 times a -3 in your head. That's going to be a 12. And in the end, we're just going to multiply it times the -1, or essentially flip the sign of the number to get a -12. And now it's much easier to do in your head. And then you can just subtract this from the first real part, which is 90. So 90 minus 12 is going to be 78. That's your answer for this question. I didn't even need to multiply the complex number to get to the imaginary part. I just needed the real part. I calculated it in my head and I got the answer. Now what if we had to calculate the whole complex number? Well, what do we do for the imaginary part? So it's actually quite simple. The only way to get an imaginary number as the product is when you have one imaginary number and another real number. So if I wanted to calculate b, how would I do that? I would take the real part of the first one and multiply it now with the imaginary part of the second one, right? So that would be 15 times a -3, and then I would take the imaginary part of the second one and multiply it of the first one and multiply it to the real part of the second one. I'm going to get a -4i times a 6. Here it is. Actually, I forgot to put an I here. So a -4i times a 6. And both of these, once again, are doable in your head. This one's going to be a -45i. This one's going to be a -24i. And when you add them together, this is going to be a -69i. And that's your b. Now, in some cases, there could be a variation of the question where they ask you for more than just a or b. For example, they could ask you for a, b. In that case, you would just have to calculate both of them and multiply them together. Sometimes it may ask you for something like 50a plus b. That would be when the a would be really small, obviously. So in that case also, you just have to evaluate it for them. You just have to multiply it. If it's possible, you can do it in your head. If not, then you can just write it down. And that's how you multiply complex numbers quickly. And I hope to see you in the next video.